Good morning, and welcome to the Hidebound Convivium. Today I'll be talking about something of a more philosophical bent and less current events and politics. Last week I talked about the abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, and as far as I know, apparently the papal throne is preparing a statement on the Vigano testimony, so perhaps there will be some discussion of that next week. But this week I want to talk about philosophical argumentation, specifically the importance of discussing first principles. I've often found it the case in debates, especially between theists and atheists, that much of the discussion occurs at the level of conclusions and less about first principles. The discussion is more important, more lively, and more to the point when atheists and theists discuss first principles. Namely, the most important one, is there a God or not? Because really nothing else can be discussed unless the first principles are given, right? So this is also why I think the argument whether or not God exists or in what fashion he exists is the subject of so much argumentation. It's so tired and everybody is very weary of it. It's because it is super important, because it is the first position from which all things need to be argued. It's not axiomatic in itself, but there's been, sort of much discussion around the axioms that construct these God does or does not exist. So I think what we need to be worried about is we don't need to attack conclusions on arguments. We need to be attacking roots of arguments, first causes of arguments. And I'll give you an example of this and how this works, and how it is very easy to take a section of an argument and separate it out and ridicule the argument through reductio ad absurdum. And this is much easier to do with religious arguments than with scientific arguments, mainly because the way our society is structured, people are raised and conditioned to be incredulous about religious claims, whereas they are raised to instinctively trust scientific claims, even if they're dubious. So I'll give you a good example from both sides. A religious person, specifically a Catholic or a Christian in general, might say there is an order of immaterial beings that we call angels. And now what you can do is you can separate this out. If you're discussing this with a theist and you're an atheist, you can separate this out and you can say, well, no one here has ever seen an angel. We don't have any good reason for believing angels exist. And even though there is anecdotal evidence that angels exist, he's correct in saying that there is no hard experimental evidence to suggest that angels in fact exist. But angels are not the point of the debate between atheism and theism. And it is possible, in fact, that a God exists and angels do not exist. So arguing on this point of angels is not helpful, right? Because it doesn't get to the root of anything. It's it's a red herring. It's not important. A similar thing can be said about specific scientific endeavors when we're discussing worldviews. Good example, black holes. You could attack a black hole on the point that we don't have direct evidence of black holes. As a matter of fact, we don't have direct evidence of black holes. We only know about black holes through indirect evidence, through gravitational disturbances that we can detect. We know that they exist, or we at least know that something like them exists, and we have built a theoretical construct around this. But it's not a cut and dried thing that black holes exist. And so you could sort of sort this out. And especially if you're dealing, say, if you're dealing with an audience that doesn't already take scientific matters on authority. You take this audience and you tell them, this scientist says that there is a gravitational well in space that is a singularity collapsed in on itself. Have you ever heard such a thing? Well, and they'll all say, no, that sounds ridiculous. And it does. On the face of it, it sounds ridiculous. But it only sounds ridiculous when you isolate it from the other theoretical work that has already been done, that has been proven through scientific experimentation, where we can say with a certain degree of certainty that black holes do in fact exist and operate in the ways that we think they do. The only difference, of course, is that in one instant you're dealing with a scientific system which has a high degree of certainty, whereas you're dealing with a religious system, on the other hand, which has a degree of certainty that is much less, especially if the first principles are not adhered to. And so the first principles of religious worldviews have to be emphasized and manifest throughout the argument. So a good example is that the religious person takes it as axiomatic that something does not occur from nothing. And so we know that the universe is made up of, more accurately, the religious person would say that anything that does not contain in and of itself the cause of its existence had to come into existence at a certain point, caused by something else. And so if you defend that axiom, it necessarily leads to the concept of the unmoved mover, which is universally acknowledged to be God, or something like God. And so when you do that, you're getting, first of all, to the strongest part of the religious argument, because the cosmological arguments and to a lesser extent the ontological arguments are the strongest logical arguments that we have for the existence of God. And they're very good, and it's very hard to attack them, I think. Of course, I'm convinced of the efficacy of these arguments, but in a logical sphere, they're fairly good. They've existed for a long time. They've been very well refined. On the other hand, the first principles of the scientific system of accounting for reality, specifically the materialistic or the physicalist account of reality, has very weak first principles, especially because as the conclusions go up, they start to undermine the first principles. Because the first principle of a physicalist or materialist understanding, of course, is that all things can be understood through scientific experimentation. But scientific experimentation requires a rational agent who can decide between experimental outcomes, who can set up proper experiments to achieve accurate results. And the farther you go up the scientific ladder, especially in regards to neuroscience and theories of the brain, you realize that human beings are actually, by a neuroscientific account, human beings are not very rational creatures, and our brains operate in certain ways that can be gamed, and it's not at all certain that our neuropathology is oriented towards getting right beliefs or getting the truth. So their first principles are very weak, but their conclusions have a high degree of certainty because of a societal moment that we live in where experimentation yields very sure results, and people trust these results. Okay, so whenever a theist is in an argument with an atheist, I always recommend, first of all, to brush up on the first principle arguments, like the cosmological argument especially, and take them back to the first principles, and don't let them assail you on points farther along in the continuum. Don't let atheists, for example, try to pin you down on the issue of angels, because you will never sell an atheist on angels alone. No one ever, becomes a believer in God through angels. And there's even, I can't think of a historic or biblical account of people being an atheist and then an angel appearing to them and this persuading them of the existence of God. In my mind, it doesn't happen. And so, you could even, all the individual doctrines of particular religions are irrelevant at the point that you're trying to argue for. Now, if you're trying to argue for, say, Catholicism or Reformed Christianity or Orthodox or Buddhism or whatever, you have to start from the principles by which that point diverges from the rest of philosophy. And if you're trying to argue with an atheist, why your religion particularly is correct, you have to walk them back through the argument for God. And if the atheist says, well, but, if you get midway through a debate about why Catholicism is the true religion, the atheist says, well, but, God doesn't exist, you have just wasted all of your time, because there was no point in chasing this rabbit hole, where you talk all about where the particular doctrines of this religion come from, and they just say, well, yes, but the whole floor of your argument is invalid. So if you go back to the point of first principles, it saves a lot of time, it gets right to the point, and I think this is the area in which religious argumentation is strongest, particularly because the first principles of scientific theory are weak without some sort of doublethink, wherein they smuggle in the implicit assumptions of the religious worldview that human beings are rational creatures that can make rational decisions. They have to smuggle that in order to come up with the first principles of their own worldview. If you point this out, it makes your position much stronger. So it's sort of like fighting someone where they are weakest, going for the weakest point in an argument. Anyway, that has been the Hidebound Convivium for today. Thank you very much for watching.